So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mary Alicia, and I'm going to help facilitate this discussion today. Your speaker for this afternoon is William Parry. He's the author of a recently published book called Against the Wall, The Art of Resistance in Palestine. And I just want to let you know that this book is for sale in the room next to the registration desk. It's $24.95.
$20 here.
What's that?
$20 here.
It's $20 here. And I was reading up on some of the reviews today, and they got amazing reviews, and it sounds like a really important piece of work, so I would encourage you to check it out and get your copy while you can. Mr. Parry is a freelance journalist and photographer who has covered the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for a number of news organizations, including the Washington Review of Middle East Affairs. And if you haven't checked out that publication, they do really good writing, and they cover the issue, I think, in a really smart, succinct way. And he's also written for The New Statesman, The Electronic Intifada, and a number of other publications. Published in, or he's established in, or you're based in London. It sounds like you're on a speaking tour for the next month and very busy. So we're really glad that you came to Portland and showed us a bit about your work. After the presentation, we'll open the floor for Q&A. And in order to facilitate as much discussion as possible, just be mindful of if you have a question or if you have a comment. I will call on folks and try to be as diplomatic about it as possible and keep track. So enjoy the presentation.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for coming to this talk when you could be listening to the angry Arab down the hallway, but you will hear the stories of many angry Arabs through this presentation. And thank you, of course, to Super and its co-sponsors for inviting me here today. It's been a fantastic experience working with them. They're incredibly well organized, and thank you to them, and thank you for them organizing weather to make me feel at home here. That was a particularly nice touch. So thank you very much. I assume most of you know quite a bit about the situation in Palestine. Show of hands if you think you know a fair amount. Okay, so most people know. So I'm going to skip through. I'll skip to the next slide. You've seen all this. This is in the room where the coffees are, showing you Palestinian-controlled land in the green or the yellow, up until the present day, how that fragmentation is taking place. There are postcards in the coffee room showing that. We can skip to the next one, please. How many of you then know who Banksy is, or about Banksy? Okay, not so many. Banksy is a British street artist, and he is probably most famous for having his identity a very closely guarded secret. Very few people know who Banksy actually is. His artwork, his street art, can command huge prices in auctions. Angelina Jolie, Brad Pitt are some of the people who have bought some original Banksy work, and it can go for several $100,000 a piece at the moment. So he's British-based, and he works very closely with an organization in London called Pictures on Walls. And Pictures on Walls every year sets up this, what they call a squat art concept shop. They rent a venue somewhere in London, usually somewhere like Oxford Street, right in the center of London, and the various artists contribute material to it, and the proceeds from that go to charities. So Banksy and Pictures on Walls were going to stop this in 2007 just to have a year out. But then when they were sitting around talking, somebody said, wouldn't it be great actually if we did this to Bethlehem, if we transported this to Bethlehem? And you know, this is where Christmas is happening, so let's do that. So they did. They invited 14 street artists from around the world, particularly the US, the EU, Europe, and the UK. Actually, UK's in there reluctantly, to come to Palestine and participate in this Santa's Ghetto project. So they all arrived there in December 2007 and spent between a week to 2 weeks there, again, doing the same sort of thing. Pictures on Walls rented out a disused restaurant in Manger Square in the heart of Bethlehem, just a stone's throw from where Jesus was supposed to have been born. And they then produced loads of work for it. Now, of course, this caught the attention of the whole art world and collectors because they could now get an original Banksy or Ron English or Blue available to them. They could bid. The trick, however, was that if you wanted to bid for one of these pieces, you had to actually go in person. You couldn't do it by phone or by internet. And in this way, Pictures on Walls wanted to force whoever was interested to actually go to Bethlehem and see what was happening, what the reality was on the ground, and how it was being strangled by the occupation and by the wall. So it's a fantastic idea to get people who wouldn't normally go there to do it if they wanted these sort of things. If we go to the next slide. So basically what they did is they, in addition to setting up and selling the artwork in Manger Square, they went around Bethlehem painting on street walls and also on Israel's separation wall. This is one of the most famous pieces from it, is by Banksy, and he allegedly asked the woman who owns the shop here which of his stencils he could paint on her wall. And she said, do the dove with the flak jacket, because I hope you can see around there's bullet holes all around, showing previous incursions from the Israelis. And in fact, the day I was there, you can see them in the distance there. On the right, they were sieging Bethlehem, and right there, they're just opposite as a refugee camp. This is by Blue, a fantastic Italian street artist, and I hope you can see the detail, but the baby is blowing soldiers who are made up of layers of dollar bills. And of course, this is a comment on the fact that the US funds Israel to the tune of $3 billion a year in military aid. Israel's the highest recipient of American aid, and that's your tax dollars that are funding this. Another one by Blue, his detail, and then how it materialized on the wall itself, again in Bethlehem. And this is by Ron English, a fantastic US street artist who's based in New York City. Same sort of thing, talking about how Americans are responsible, through their tax dollars, to funding the oppression that goes on of Palestinians. This is part of the wall is in Aida camp in Bethlehem. Bethlehem is home to 3 refugee camps, and of course these people were refugees from 1948 when the State of Israel was created, and in the run-up to that, when 750,000 people or so were forced to flee their homes. They all left, of course, thinking they would come back to their homes, and 65 or so years on, they still haven't returned. And for that reason, Palestinians today form the largest refugee community in the world. 1 in 3 refugees in the world is Palestinian. This is by Sam 3, a Spanish guy. You can see the writing there in white, and that's pretty much about arm's height, just to give you some sort of scale of what this is actually like. These 2 are also by Banksy, and these 2 inadvertently upset the local population. Now, Palestinians day in, day out are subjected to a dehumanizing treatment by the Israelis through the system of checkpoints and, of course, confiscation of their lands and so forth, and the stomping of their rights. So when Banksy drew a rat with a catapult, the Palestinians took offense to this because, again, they didn't want to be dehumanized further by some Westerner coming in there trying to do some good. So that was duly defaced. This one he painted on a wall owned by a family, which is one of the richest families in Bethlehem. And they have a huge charity shop called 3 Arches. Now, being canny business people, they actually cut out that whole section of wall and have preserved that piece behind their huge shop. And it's up for auction. When I was there in September last, they'd had a bid of $200,000. They're still waiting for a bit more. So if you want a Banksy original, there's one still available for you in Bethlehem. On the left is a Fail, a art collective based in New York as well. And on the right is a piece by Swoon. And all that writing there is all paper that she's cut out and then glued along that tower there. And basically the woman is weaving a comment about how people who are outforced militarily have to resort to other ways to try to counter that force and achieve their rights. She was inspired to put that on the Sentry Tower here because she'd heard a story of a 17-year-old boy from Aida camp opposite it who had gone up and planted a Palestinian flag on the top. He was caught and arrested and given 7 years just for that act. Now, the sale of all that artwork by Pictures on Walls raised $1 million for local charities. They gave some of the money to WEAM, which is a conflict resolution organization based in Bethlehem. They sent a number of Palestinian students to art college. And every year they go back, every summer, some of the artists who work with Pictures on Walls go back out to the West Bank and work with local kids, trying to give them an outlet for expression. Now, I went there in 2008 to do this. I was based there for about 10 weeks on the ground, getting whatever graffiti I thought was relevant, and also the stories from the Palestinians on the ground. And to me, this was one of the one of the best pieces of graffiti because it spoke so much about the reality on the ground there. Of course, the Jewish pioneers who went there in the early 20th century went there with that maxim that it was a land without people for a people without land, and completely ignored the indigenous population that had been there for countless generations. And also today, going out to the West Bank, whether it took me 10 minutes to get somewhere on the other side of the wall here, or an hour or 3 hours deeper into the West Bank, every time I would come back to Jerusalem, I was just struck by the fact that most of the Israelis that I met didn't care what was going on there, even though this was their votes that allowed this to happen. So there was this blinkered approach that struck me, and I just, you get pretty angry going out and seeing all this injustice, coming back and watching people live their lives normally, having all sorts of freedoms, when you've just seen such oppression of freedoms. So it had a lot of resonance, and of course, for us here in the United States and in Europe, we are also obliged under our various signatory treaties that we're part of to help stop this oppression, but of course we don't. And this sort of manifested, this is the Karen Hesod organization, which was celebrating its 90th birthday last year, I think it is. They had a series of posters in Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv running down. And this is one of the earlier ones. And again, that whole idea of somebody coming there, there's a land that's barren, and they are going to make it bloom. There's no sign of the indigenous Palestinian population, which of course it had a very long and rich heritage there. And on the right, a modern day version of this. This is in the Israeli colony of Har Homa, or settlement, which is between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. And it says the view of a mountain, a Dutch village with the view of a mountain. And again, part of this is actually built on a Palestinian man's land, an old guy named Abu Said, who was born 10 years before the state of Israel existed. You'll see his situation later on, but just remember this idea. When I went into the real estate agent's office to ask about buying property there, they showed me the beautiful glossy property brochure, and when you look behind these properties to see where Abu Said's house was, it was just landscaped, beautiful gardens. He was completely obliterated from it. So how long he'll survive there, we'll have to see. And most recently, 2 weeks ago, I was there. This is Mali Adumim, one of Israel's largest colonies on occupied Palestinian land. This is one of the Jewish homes, and in the distance there are Bedouin Palestinians. So these people drive every day when they go to Jerusalem, and they see that sign, nothing to see here. They look out their back windows, and they see the Palestinians there. They are living on their land, but again, they do absolutely nothing about it. Now, Israel has a right to build a wall. If it wants to build a wall for security reasons, it has every right to do that, and it has every obligation to protect its citizens' security. So that's not the problem. The problem is the route of the wall. The 1949 armistice line, or the Green Line as it's commonly called, runs here for 315 kilometers all the way around there. The route of the wall runs for over 700 kilometers, so it's more than twice the length of the internationally recognized border between the West Bank and Israel proper. And why does it do that? Because Israel, of course, has for 45 years nearly built its colonies deep into the West Bank, which are now home to 500,000 Jewish Israelis. These people can come from anywhere in the world to live there. Palestinians, of course, who are refugees, have no right to return here. There are 220 colonies and outposts, which are sort of fledgling colonies, if you like, situated through here. And although they only account for 3% of the actual West Bank land, Israel controls 45% of the West Bank in order to control the movement of people and to protect these Israelis living here illegally in that land. The route of the wall is 85% of it is in the West Bank, cutting off and annexing all of this land. And that is some of the most fertile agricultural land in the West Bank. And it is stealing 10% of the West Bank, and this bit here is responsible for 16% of the Palestinian West Bank agricultural economy. So you can imagine just losing 16% of your land right off like that. It would have a massive impact. Now if you keep in mind these two fingers here, the Kedumim and Ariel fingers, these are two of the largest settlements. This cuts 22 kilometers deep into the West Bank. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that that is pretty much right around here. And they sit over, as I said, some of the most fertile land, but they also sit over the Western Aquifer and other sources of water. And these are crucial, of course, for Palestinian livelihoods. And Israel, as the occupying power, has full control of Palestinian water and Palestinian resources. A Palestinian cannot dig a well without the permission of the Israeli authorities, and that rarely comes. The WHO, the World Health Organization, says that people should have a minimum of 100 liters of water a day for domestic consumption. The Israeli colonies on this land, they use 235 liters of water a day, or they get that allocated to them. The Palestinians get 66 liters of water given to them. Palestinian farmers have to buy water back from the Israeli water company, Mekarot, to water their crops. If you go next slide. And this, of course, has a devastating impact on agriculture in Palestine. This is a gate in a community called Jeus up in the West Bank. And it used to be, this whole area used to sort of be the breadbasket of the West Bank. It used to export fruit and vegetable all around the region. Today it's a basket case. This is a tractor owned by a Palestinian guy, very, very charismatic, lovely old guy named Abu Azam. Some of you may know him if you do any advocacy work over there. Abu Azam isn't in this picture because on that particular day he had lost his permit because he speaks to people like me about the stories that are going on there. So if you're a landowner and your land is behind the wall now, you have to apply to the Israelis to get a permit to access your land. In 2007, the UN OCHA office said that just 17% of farmers got permits to access their land. Now, Abu Azam's wife Siham is there with their grandson and their son-in-law, and they're sitting on what Abu Azam calls his greatest weapon, his F-16. This is what Israel is afraid of, being able to continue to create livelihoods and carry on. In 2002, Jeus produced 9 million kilograms of fruit and vegetable a year. In 2008, they were producing 4 million. So productivity had dropped by more than half. So this is the sort of impact it is having on communities that previously used to produce and export fruit and vegetables. 2/3 of the people, he said, in Jeus were now food aid dependent, which is absolutely preposterous when you think about the fact that they sit on some of the richest fertile land. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see Abu Azam there. I asked him if he minded me photographing him in his undershirt like that, and he said that his days as a sex symbol had long gone. He's here with a photograph of Rachel Corrie, who he calls his hero. And he's pointing to the wall here and his land beyond the wall. And then you have the Israeli settlements beyond there. Now the wall is 6 kilometers or 3.5 miles from the Green Line. And when the people said, why do you need such a huge space of our land to take? The Israelis said, well, we need it as a buffer zone. 3.5 miles. Now, what they won't tell you is if you look at the industrial plans for the Zufin settlement here, they have room to expand, permission to expand all the way up to the Green Line for industrial and residential use. So the whole idea of this buffer zone is a complete ruse. It's there to deceive the rest of the people in the West. Now I'll just give you an overview of some of the artwork and graffiti there and some of the themes and styles that are common on the wall. This again gives you an idea of some of the scale of some of the work on it. This is a group of Catholic people. Sometimes they're as small as this, sometimes they're 80, 90 people, depending on the tourists who come in. And they recite the rosary back and forth. This is just in Bethlehem. But again, you can get the size of the mural here. It's absolutely stunningly big. Lots of images of pigs and doves. The doves, of course, being Palestinians or peace, and the pigs being Israel and the West. Get some styles that we're more familiar with here in the West. And humor is often used as a way to sort of diffuse the anger and hardship. This is an example of Dutch humor. If your Dutch isn't so hot, it says easy falafel, mix chickpeas, coriander, cumin, and onion, and rotate the wall for the rest of the recipe. This one here in the middle says, in my previous life I was the Berlin Wall. The beer was better there. Now you'll notice, oh sorry, one sec. You'll just notice that all the handwriting here is similar. This is in Aram. And this is a very tense place at the moment. Somebody was killed there yesterday by the Kalandia checkpoint. A Palestinian was shot dead there. But the reason the handwriting is all the same is because there's a Dutch company called sendamessage.nl. And if you want to put a message on the wall, you can email them with your credit card details and tell them whatever message you want, like these ones. And a Palestinian guy goes, spray paints it on there, takes a photograph, and emails it to you. And the money apparently goes to charitable causes. Now that's all lovely and good, but you also have to bear in mind when you see this, what it must be like to Palestinians whose livelihoods are and property values are absolutely being hammered by the wall when they see things like, "Dear Mom, I love you," or "So and so, will you marry me?" You know, it's sort of two very different realities side by side. Some more humor. I want my ball back, for those of you who can't see it in the back. And on a recent trip, this response in another section of the wall. And where humor doesn't work, sometimes just getting these sort of sentiments off your chest can be helpful as well. And in addition to that sort of stuff, you got lots of images and quotes from various freedom fighters like Gandhi, Che Guevara, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, Benjamin Franklin, all these sort of people. Their quotations and their images are on the wall.
Is that journalist that was still in jail that's trying to get freed? What's his name? What the guy that's wanting to get his freedom? Somebody.
Khader Adnan?
No. The Indian guy. Wounded Knee. Leonard Peltier. Is that Leonard Peltier? It sure looks like.
On there? No, Che Guevara. Yeah. Some pertinent quotations, like this one from Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, "If you prick us, do we not bleed?" Lots of quotations from the Bible, which in many cases have a real particularity to this. This one's talking about dividing walls of hostility. This is a bit of Palestinian artwork. "History teaches everything, including the future," and underneath it, it says, "Know your history." And there's a beautiful picture there of, there's a picture of a beautiful Palestinian woman dressed in her traditional costume from, again, pre-1948. And related to this, we get the next slide.
Probably a Nazi survivor.
Sorry?
Probably a Nazi survivor that wrote that thing in Berlin.
I don't know. We have, does anybody know with God on our side?
Hitler.
Hitler?
George Bush.
George Bush? I was also told Bob Dylan, so I'll take all those answers and add them to my routine. This one, on a musical theme, continued. Any ideas?
Inflates the wall.
Perfect, yeah.
Oh.
We have some great wordplay. If you can't see it, it says captivating. And this, we've got a lot more artwork coming up done by somebody or some group called Vin7. So this one says how many kids in jail for freedom, and it shows basically that asymmetrical conflict going on between kids throwing rocks and one of the mightiest military machines in the world. Anybody recognize this? Yeah, Delacroix. And what I just caught this next one 2 weeks ago on the wall. I think it's really quite stunning. Liberty, of course, has her chest covered up a bit more in this one, but and by the same group or person, Leila Khalid, who of course was a refugee herself from 1948, who went on to be the first female person in the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and who partook in hijackings of flights in 1969 and 1970, and who's still seen as a freedom fighter for many Palestinians. And there's lots of examples of, or like this, basically likening the wall to apartheid.
Yeah.
And of course, messages of Americans to Americans. If you read this one here at the top, it says, "Question your leaders." Somewhere else there's a quotation by Immanuel Kant, Sapere Aude, which is basically from his seminal essay on enlightenment, basically saying, dare to discern. Don't just take for granted what everybody tells you, your leaders in particular. Question it yourself. And so it's echoed here as well. And of course there's lots of Palestinian symbolism as well. Again, the 750,000 refugees from 1948 and again in 1967, displaced in 1967. who took their keys and oftentimes their documents with them when they fled their homes, imagining they were going to be back within weeks or months, and who still aren't. So there were lots of keys up and down the wall. And this one says, the right of return is a return that doesn't die, and you've got many symbols here. You've got the tent down in the bottom right, the one man pushing against the wall, and this one grabbing chains and pulling chains. And this one which simply says return as well. Lots of characters, people relevant to Palestinian identity, whether they're spiritual leaders like Sheikh Yassin, people from PFLP and other things, Mahmoud Darwish, the late great Palestinian poet, or Yasser Arafat and his Fatah party. And this guy, anybody know this guy? Handallah, of course. Handallah was the political character created by Naji al-Ali, the late great political cartoonist, who for decades used to use his political cartoons to lay into basically the corrupt Gulf and other Arab leaders in the region, and of course Israel and its sponsor America. So he's all over the wall. Naji al-Ali was made a refugee when he was 8 years old. The family fled north to Lebanon, and Handallah, he said, would always have his back to the viewer until Palestine was liberated and free. On the right we have the Sabra cactus, and this also represents Palestinian steadfastness. You can take a piece of the cactus, plant it in the ground, and it'll grow from there. What it also used to do was to demarcate where properties were. It used to just sort of be like a natural border in historical pre-1948 Palestine. And to this day, if you drive around Israel and you see a field with lots of Sabra, stop, get out of your car, and go look. And what you'll probably see are the remains of the 570 destroyed villages from 1948. I did this, the Washington Report magazine is here. There might be an article in one of the recent ones about such a journey, where we just took a book by Khalidi and Salman Abu Sitta. One did the maps, and one did overviews, very, very short overviews of the 570 villages that were destroyed. And you can just take them and drive around Israel and stop and see these ruins. It's very, very upsetting and unsettling, because there are also, of course, Israeli farms or whatever right beside them, and the people just ignore the past. Anybody speak Arabic here? Read Arabic? Can you read that one? Again? Which means?
It means we're going to keep fighting until we win.
Yeah, okay.
Until we get back.
Right, yeah. So that's Handallah there, and you have Sabra with the kafia breaking the wall there. That's by a Mexican group showing solidarity with Palestinians. And then you have what is a lot of nonsense written all around the wall. Or at least I thought it was nonsense until I came to the US. A couple of days ago, somebody said, this is a Mormon comment. Something about the magic underwear, which I had never known about, but apparently that's what it is. So I take back my comment to all the Mormons who may have been upset. This is one other type of graffiti that you'll see up and down the wall. To exist is to resist, it says. And so that's up and down the wall, but also just in the lives of the people you meet. As you'll see, they go through extraordinary hardship, and yet they refuse to get up and leave as Israel wants them to. So that's echoed in the hundreds of thousands, the millions of people who maintain their rights, or try to maintain their rights to survive there. And when you get people like Bono or your president saying the Palestinians have to embrace nonviolence, he should really go and meet the millions of Palestinians who day in, day out face brutal repression by the Israelis and who respond in nonviolent ways every single day. Now, I won't read all this, but it's basically the International Court of Justice in 2004, which is the highest court in the world, declared that the wall was illegal where it is built on Palestinian land. So that's 85% of its route is illegal. And Israel should dismantle it and pay reparation to the Palestinians who have been impacted by the wall. And then it goes on to say that only once the wall is gone, will Palestinians be able to exercise their rights to freedom of movement, work, education, health, and an adequate standard of living. Now the slides, the artwork, and the stories that follow pertain to each of these different elements. So the question for Palestinians is, how do you get around the wall? This is one way. And this is another. There are loads of images of ladders, both painted onto the wall and also actual ladders built with whatever happens to be around. Palestinians are very resourceful, so if there's an old wooden skip, they'll turn that upside down and use that to climb over parts of the wall where it's relatively short. If we go to the next slide. These pictures of the walls were drawn by children in a neighborhood called Al Judeira, which has been severely impacted by the wall. It's a neighborhood of East Jerusalem, which used to be connected to it, and that is now severely, severely depressed by the wall. One of the children's graffitis says, "I'm not a rat, I'm a human like you." And again, it's very, very moving when you see these sort of images of children penned in. You can get around it this way with a pair of wire cutters. Just to the right of the barbed wire, there was a big hole in the wall. This is in Bethania, where Lazarus was supposed to have been born and raised from the dead. And another way to get in is with a permit. Israel has decreased the number of permits that it gives to Palestinians drastically since the Second Intifada. But it is one way that Palestinians can make more money than they can do in the West Bank. These men are at Bethlehem checkpoint and they're queuing to get onto the other side of the wall. The process can take up to 3 hours just to go from one side to about 100 yards the other side. In the distance are the lights of Gilo, which is one of the settlements that is surrounding Bethlehem. Bethlehem Governorate, the government there has control of only 13% of the entire governorate. So if you imagine Oregon and the government here only have control of 13% of it, the other 87% is controlled by some foreign oppressor. Imagine what kind of an impact that's going to have on your growth, your ability to exploit your resources and things like that. Absolutely profound. So at the right-hand side there's a metal column, there's a corridor, and effectively it becomes a metal cage. There's one side for people coming in and one side for people who want to get onto the other side of the wall. So it goes up for about 100 yards. And at the top of that, people have been waiting here from 2 a.m. for their turn to be the first ones to get beyond the wall. Now this was shot in February, a couple of years ago, and the temperatures were similar to what it is outside right now. So it's pretty chilly. They burn pieces of cardboard inside there to try and stay warm for the several hours while they're waiting. You'll see in the next series of shots, this is at the top of the corridor, there's a turnstile, electronic turnstile, and a guard in another room controls the opening of that. So every now and again the guard will let maybe 20 men go through. And once he or she does that, there's a vacuum as the workers try to fill this corridor. And you can see that's about a second and a half, 2 seconds of shots as they pushed and try and get in there. It's an incredibly dehumanizing situation. And then, of course, the electronic turnstile stops. The men wait there for about another 15 minutes or so before the next one happens. When it stops, anybody around the mouth of this entrance is clinging on as hard as they can for, again, 5, 10, 15 minutes until the next ones go, as you'll see. So there they are sitting in there, just packed in there. They're incredibly tired and fed up of this lifestyle. But Palestinians always manage to have a bit of humor to counter that daily oppression like here. But there you can see the men hanging on to the tops of the bars. The man on the right is showing us his permit, his work permit to get in. In order to get one, you have to be 30 years old, male, have one child and be married, or be married and have one child. Otherwise you don't qualify for it. The sad reality is that most of these men are going to go work in the construction business, building the colonies on occupied Palestinian land, making the viability or the prospect of an independent Palestinian state less and less likely. But the money is there, and they have to feed their families and send their children to school, so they keep on saying, we have no choice. This is the reality. One of the other sad realities is that oftentimes it's a Palestinian person who will have contacts with the Israelis who will get the permits and then he will sell them to the Palestinians at overinflated prices. But again, it gives you some idea of the desperation that they buy these anyway. He says he will get about $40 a day working in the settlements. Now, these next two shots are pictures of the people who have been at the front of the queue and have got through the wall finally, and they basically try and catch up on a bit of sleep. You can see their lunches above them there, and on the next shot as well, they're just sleeping. You can see this man's pillow is just a pair of bricks down on the far right. Now, if you don't get a permit, another way to get through the wall is simply by going through holes in the wall. There are loads of holes in the wall, and in this particular time, I watched about 80 men go through in under an hour. This is Al Jadera again that I mentioned before. Where the wall goes to the right, it cuts off the former main road linking it to East Jerusalem. So again, if you can imagine all the neighborhoods around Portland here that are suddenly cut off from Portland, you can imagine what's going to happen to those local economies. They're just going to shrivel. They're not going to be able to survive. So I watched from a rooftop here, these guys go through. To my left, there was another entrance, and men were legging it through on there as well. These guys ranged from about 15 to 55, and again, they told me that they were going into Israel to find some work. On my last visit 2 weeks ago, I was up in northern, in the Galilee, in farm areas, and you can see mattresses where these workers go and they camp out on these mattresses in the night, hoping to evade any sort of raids by the Israelis. Unfortunately, not everybody gets through. During my time there, over about 15 minutes, this is what happened, and then we just have a series of shots showing this. This guy finds about 4 people underneath this truck. There's a bit of kicking, booting going on, and threats. And then they get rounded up onto this side. The Israeli commander said that these guys were terrorists trying to infiltrate to undertake terrorist activities. Now again, this happens every single day. If these were terrorists, you would certainly read about it in the New York Times.
Like illegal aliens in Arizona.
I'm sorry?
Like illegal aliens in Arizona.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
Cool.
So this sort of shows you Al Jadera today. It's just everything there is being evacuated. Life is being destroyed there. There's no economy. The only business, only activity you see are taxis coming down to that dead end, dropping off men to get around the other side.
Did they catch them? Did they put them back over, or did they put them in jail?
I was told by a human rights lawyer that if it's their first offense, they will get fined. After that, then they go to jail in Israel. They're detained in Israel.
Well, at the rate of 80 an hour through one hole, it'd be pretty full prisons pretty fast.
Yeah, but I mean, they're not catching them all the time. They will go there for a number of months.
And those holes will stay, Israelis don't bother to come around and close the holes every day.
I assume not. I mean, there are Israelis who depend on this cheap labor.
Sure.
Yeah, exactly. Now, that says Control-Alt-Delete. So again, if you can't get a permit or you can't get around the wall, there's lots of graffiti about destroying the wall or breaking through the wall. Some of it a bit surreal, like the next slide, with a massive rhino coming through. On the right, you have a zipper being pulled down, and behind it you have the Palestinian flag, the Mediterranean Sea, and a nice beach as well. And in the next slide, you'll see there's lots of, another one of the wall being broken down, and people having access to Jerusalem. And of course, Jerusalem is the spiritual, the economic, and the cultural heart of Palestine. And it is the holy spot for both Palestinian Muslims and Christians. Al-Aqsa Mosque is the third holiest shrine in Islam, and so a lot of the pilgrims try to get there during the holy seasons, as well as the Christians for their holy seasons. Now, this is taken in Abu Dis, which is a university town, 8,000 students. The university has lost 1/3 of its land to the wall here, but they fought a very spirited campaign, and 1/3 was a lucky amount. Otherwise, there would have been more gone. And where the graffiti is, you can see the Dome of the Rock in the distance. Now, a student I spoke to, 5 minutes used to take him to get to university classes. It now takes him 90 minutes, and he has to take 2 buses and go through a checkpoint. Checkpoints are places of extraordinary humiliation for the Palestinians and great delay. You can stand in checkpoints for hours waiting to get to the other side, as you saw before. So imagine, again, you trying to get to university here with this sort of wall barrier stopping you from getting there. If you go to the next slide. This is now Ramadan. In September, it's about 100 degrees Fahrenheit outside. Many of these people have arrived from dawn trying to get access to Al-Aqsa. Israel stipulates that if you're a woman and you want to get through, you have to be 45 years of age or older. If you're a man, you have to be 50 years of age or older. But that doesn't always necessarily, just because you're 45 or 50 doesn't mean you're going to get through. On the left-hand side, you have the men's queue, and on the right-hand side, the women's queue. And it's a little one-person wide hole that these people try and file through. If you go to the next slide. A lot of the elderly and the disabled, as you saw in that last slide, there's a man there with a cane trying to get through. He couldn't get through. And a lot of the elderly people as well just cannot compete in this sort of a scrum. This patient lady, however, was there with her granddaughter, and she, over the course of about 5 minutes, just took one step to the left every single minute, and eventually got behind the soldier, and the people in front of her let her slip through, and her little granddaughter just sort of winked at me and went, shh. So that was one of the happy cases. Unhappy for the rest of the people who do get stuck on the other side of the wall, and again, it is a very tense standoff between them. Invariably there's tear gas, sound bombs, and occasionally live ammunition or rubber-coated bullets going on. The woman up on the left there was flashing her American passport, and he still wasn't letting her get through with her US passport. Now, Jerusalem is East Jerusalem, occupied East Jerusalem, which it has been occupied since 1967, is home to 6 Palestinian hospitals. Now, the 4 million Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank are severely restricted from accessing those hospitals now. Certainly if you're male and you're between the ages of 15 and 30, chances are you're not going to get a permit for security reasons. What the hospitals now do is they send out tiny mobile units out into the field in the West Bank to try to give a basic level of provision to these communities. So in this case, this is St. John's Eye Hospital, going to look for congenital eye diseases as well as glaucoma in the elderly to try and see if there's diabetes and other things coming on. But these people, again, are barred from reaching their hospitals. And of course, those hospitals are often staffed by West Bankers, West Bank ID holders. And those people have to now go through the wall every morning to get to their work. And that is, again, wrought with all sorts of complications and delays. So it is having a very profound effect on the hospitals. There are over 500 checkpoints, well last year anyway, there were over 500 checkpoints throughout the West Bank, controlling the movement of people, and there were almost the same number of flying checkpoints, ones that are mobile checkpoints where they just stop, set up, and control the movement of people. The British medical journal The Lancet did a 7-year study looking at pregnant women and how the checkpoints in the wall impacted them. And over 7 years they found that there were 69 children born at checkpoints, 35 of those children died, and 5 of the mothers died giving birth. So consequently, in a lot of these villages, what the women do is a month before they're due to give birth, they leave their villages to go live with families in other villages where they're not going to have the same restricted access or less access, less restrictions, or fewer restrictions, and they stay there. And you can imagine what kind of an impact that has on families at a very, very special time in family life. This is by a guy named Arrowfish. This is in 2004, and it's at the Abu Dis roundabout in East Jerusalem. He's apparently the guy who inspired Banksy to first go over there, and Banksy went there in 2005 for his first visit. And what I'm just going to show you now is a series of sort of images showing you views through the wall or beyond the wall, and then contrast those with the actual views of people's homes of the wall. Again, Banksy, this used to have a beautiful alpine view of mountains and lakes and forests. Somebody has gone and de-beautified it. If you want to save it for the discussion, we can talk about what some of the Palestinians feel about the artwork on the wall and this whole idea of de-beautifying it. But I'll save that for the end. Lots of doorways, and again, they're showing the historical Palestine with a wall and access to Al-Aqsa. And this is the former family home of the Bassam family. They have, the father is an architect and his daughter is an architect as well. The wall is about 2 meters from their house now. They had to fight to even get those 2 meters. It was going to be even closer. And their business has gone from 50 staff down to 5 staff as a result of the impact of the wall on Bethlehem. That's from their front door. That's Dima, one of the architects, and that's just a reflection from their front windows. This woman is Clémence. She was also made a refugee in 1948 when she was 2 years old. They went to Jordan for a bit, and then she came back and married a Bethlehemite who has since passed away. She lives right by the border there in Bethlehem. She's got land trapped on the other side, which she cannot access. But she's put these metal shutters here because the Israelis used to find it was fun from their sentry tower in the distance to shine the lasers from their guns through her window in the evening onto the wall of her home.
It's downright cruelty.
This is another family. They have 10 acres of land on the other side here, which is now lost to them, that had olive groves. They now can no longer reach those olive groves. However, the Jewish Israelis here in these colonies up here of Gilo do have access to that land now. And there's an old Ottoman law that the Israelis use, which is that if you do not work your land for 3 years, it then can go to state. It is then passed over to the state. So obviously these people cannot access it, so their land is just going to become state land eventually. But it was kind of these sort of settings that really hit me, affected me, when I saw people doing everyday domestic things like putting out your laundry, and then seeing the people who were responsible for it having erected this massive wall which then cuts you off from your land, and how these people go about every day with some sort of equanimity. How do they manage to just keep the peace, as it were? If we go to the next slide, this is a view from inside the house again. There are so many homes where every time you look out a window, it's just concrete. And the next one is of the woman's mirror. And again, as she looks in the mirror, she can just see the wall there as well. It's all around you. You can imagine what kind of a psychological and emotional impact that will have on people. This is now a view from a hotel room. The Bethlehem checkpoint is along to the right, immediately along this street, and access to Manger Square is down on the left-hand side. This concrete corridor here is absolutely crippling Bethlehem and the cities beyond it, because this used to be the passageway, the main artery linking Bethlehem and Hebron and further beyond with Jerusalem. And that, of course, now is all concrete corridor. The reason it's concrete corridor is because of this white dome here, which is Rachel's tomb. And Rachel's tomb is a place where a lot of Jewish women go to try to, when they want to conceive, they go there, hoping that there's going to be some sort of divine help with that. So this is now a parking lot for Israeli women who want to come and get that divine help. The houses and the businesses along here, again, this used to be one of the prime areas in Bethlehem, full of beautiful homes. Most of those homes are abandoned. The Bassam family, who you saw before, the value of their house is 25% of what it used to be. And 90% of the businesses here are shut down, just gone. So this is the kind of impact that it's having on the local community. Now I'm taking you up to the northern part of the West Bank. This is a village called Nazlet Isa, which is one of the few places where the Green Line and the wall actually do coincide. And this is the house of a man named Abdul Halim. Abdul Halim had 5 shops. This used to be a busy corridor between the West Bank and Israel, and a lot of traffic used to come and go back and forth. Again, a lot of these workers would go into Israel through here. So there was a lot of business which is completely being shut now. So he lost 5 of his businesses there, and he was building his home here. When the Israeli military came and said, "You've got a great location with a fantastic vantage point, we're going to set up on the top of your house here, and all further construction stops." So you can see here he's got no windows and no doors up here. They're all stuck in these 2 rooms here waiting to be put in there. So that was bad enough, but then 18 months later, the Israelis said, "Unfortunately, we're going to have to demolish your house because it's in the way of the wall." The only thing that stopped them, of course, was the Israeli military on top saying, "Don't demolish it, we need it, it's valuable for us." So to this day, he has a frozen demolition order on his house. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that his house and the wall, there's Abdul Halim. He says he gets lots of job offers as a Saddam Hussein lookalike for TV. You can see that the wall and his house actually become one and the same thing for the entire length of his house, and then the concrete goes on again. He's lost also half of his land. He has 82 dunams, which is again about 20 acres. He's lost half of that to the wall. Here he is on the ground floor, very proudly showing me his furniture that he imported from Turkey, which he can't use. And he's got 2 sons. Now, in Palestinian families, when the sons marry, they move up to the floor above the first generation, and then the next son will move to the floor above, and the whole family is based there. And of course, he's having great difficulty finding brides for his sons as a result of the situation here. And when you come into his house here on the ground floor, it's just all barbed wire up the top, so there's obviously no access for him. He'll endanger his life if he tries to move up there. Now, childhood. One of the most emotional things is to see children around the wall and to think of what kind of impact this is having on Palestine, or will have on the future of these children. These children's futures have been completely blighted by the wall. Again, it's an illegal structure there, and yet Israel is getting away with destroying the future of these children. So as you drive around and you see the children, it's just profoundly disturbing, because you think, what is going to happen to these kids? If Israel wants a secure future, is it really going to get that by blighting these lives in this way? So a lot of the artwork is very moving because it juxtaposes the brute reality of the occupation and the wall with these childhood scenes like Alice in Wonderland and other images that sort of juxtapose that childhood innocence with that harsh, brutal nature of the wall. This is Abu Said. I mentioned him before, born in 1938. Where this house is, that's his grandson, also named Said. Well, he's Abu Said, he's Said. And Said on the bottom there. In the distance is Har Homa colony, which is home to 15,000 Jews. Any Jew around the world is allowed to move to Israel, of course, because they're Jewish. But this family's rights, as I'll tell you, have been completely compromised to allow those Jewish people to have their rights. If we go to the next slide, there he is there again. You see the size of the colony. If we go to the next slide, you'll see it in even more perspective. That's his Abu Said's house, and that's the colony there. Every time I go back there, it grows and grows and grows. He has 8 dunams, which is 2 acres of land, and 5 of it, more than half of his land here, is being built on by this place, by these construction companies. In the 90s, as construction began opposite, Israelis came, photographed his home, and said, if you build further onto your house, we will demolish whatever you build. So he has a frozen border on his house. No natural growth is allowed. And yet, you can see what's flourishing opposite. Now, he is one of the few, well, there are about 33,000 Palestinians who, if the wall continues along its present route, will be stuck in what is called the seam zone, which means they are on the west side of the wall. So if you remember where the wall was cutting through, Israel's on this side, on the east side is the West Bank. There are 33,000 Palestinians who will be stuck on the west side with the Israelis, and when you factor in the Palestinians also in Jerusalem, you've got about 200,000, an extra 200,000 Palestinians living with Israelis. So when Israel says this is a security wall, you've got to say, well, hang on, you've got close to 250,000 Palestinians you've just upset, made very angry, living amongst your community. So this man and his family find themselves in this limbo, twilight zone, between what Israel calls Israel on this side, and then the wall is behind him, and his extended community is in Beit Sahur, which is a part of Bethlehem. So if Israel has given them all permits, humanitarian permits, visitor permits, so that they can live here. Otherwise, they'd be chucked off their land. How long it's going to be before they are chucked off their land, it won't be too long, I'm sure. If these people want to buy lamb and chicken, they would normally do that in the West Bank because it's cheaper there in Bethlehem. But Israel disallows them from bringing any meat home. What they can do is hop in a taxi, drive through this colony, where of course they're hated, beyond there, and try and buy some fruit and vegetable there. They're incredibly poor, they cannot afford these taxis. They're allowed to bring fruit and vegetables back from the West Bank, from Bethlehem, but they're restricted to 3 kilograms. Now there are about 35 people living in this house. You can imagine what 3 kilograms, how far that will go. The mothers here and the 15 children, their schools are in Bethlehem, and rather than go through the checkpoint every day and face the humiliation and the delays that creates, what they've done is found it easier to just rent a house on the other side in Beit Sahur. The kids and them live there for 6 days a week, and then they come back and are reunited with the family for 1 day a week. So again, just juxtaposing children and this graffiti of childhood or innocence. This fellow on the left, his name is Saif. This is in Dahiyat al-Barid, a section of East Jerusalem, which is now, well, he's on the Israeli-controlled side of the wall. Unfortunately, immediately opposite are his 5 uncles and his grandfather, who are stuck on the other side. They can speak to each other over the tops of the roof, or because the family on this side has Jerusalem IDs, they are able to go through the checkpoint at Hizma or Kalandia and visit the family. And that is now a 40-minute journey at least, just to get around like that. Because a lot of the families have been trapped on the other side of the wall, obviously the values of their properties have gone down, their incomes have dropped, and it has also put a huge amount of pressure on any Palestinian homes on the other side of the wall, because all the Palestinians who were on the other side living cheaply have now had to go into Jerusalem and rent the little space that is there. So there's a tiny amount of land, and it's shot rent prices up.
Is the Israeli side less ugly than the Palestinian side, like with bricks or something, or is it different one side or the same on both sides?
It is a good question, and there are much. I'll come back to it afterwards. The girl on the right is a resident of Abu Dis, and her father and uncle used to work in the construction business. They've had no work for 4 years. They took me into the kitchen. This was a completely random visit. I was just photographing on the street, and they said, hey, come on in, let's talk. So I went in there, and the only food in the entire kitchen was a bag of lentils from the United Nations. That was it. As we talked, it got darker and darker, and I thought, when are you going to turn the lights on? And of course, they'd had their electricity cut from them. So these people were living in absolute squalor. And again, this sweet little girl, you wonder what kind of future she's going to have.
Could I ask you a question very quickly? Do the Palestinians grovel to make money in realty in the Palestinian lands? I asked this of a program about 61 Palestinians had their homes bulldozed down by Palestinians. It's a question.
That I'm not aware of, but again, I don't have any information on that. Right. Another early one by Banksy, of a kid with a sand bucket, and it used to be, again, a beach scene in the distance. Now, I'll take you up to places like Nelin and Bilin, places where a number of the communities have been for years struggling to fight the annexation of their land. The wall is cutting them off from their land, and what the Palestinians have done is they've organized anti-wall, non-violent anti-wall committees. Every week, they and the villagers, with internationals like me and you, and a number of Israeli activists as well, go to the wall and basically armed with banners, flags, shirts, and songs and so forth, protest against the annexation of their land. If we go to the next slide, this is Nelin. The people of Nelin have lost 88% of their land over 6 decades, or just over 6 decades, to the Israelis, and they are losing more of it in this latest phase of the wall coming through here, taking again their olive groves with them, and that is the Israeli colony in the distance. The day I landed for this book, a boy in Nelin, aged 10 years old, Ahmed Musa, was shot in the head with live ammunition when he was playing with his friend and killed at this spot. That's his bloodstained blue shirt there hanging as a memorial. This is a guy named Akil. He is 40 years old, and his brother was a member of these anti-wall organizing committees in Nelin. He was part of the committee. They came to arrest his brother Awad because Awad, of course, is organizing these things. And Israel tries to break up the community by arresting and intimidating people. They also come in the middle of the night and arrest large numbers of children and say, we were throwing rocks. Who else was throwing rocks? If you tell us who else was throwing rocks, we'll let you go. There's all sorts of intimidation used by the Israelis to get these false confessions. Now, his brother was being arrested, so he tried to intervene, and he got 4 steel-coated rubber bullets from a distance of 7 yards to his eye, to his cheek, and to his chest. He subsequently lost all sight in his right eye. This is one of the cases where they tried to transfer him to the St. John's Eye Hospital in East Jerusalem, but as you can see, in this condition, he was an obvious threat to the Israelis, and they wouldn't let him go through. Now, the next year, in 2009, his brother, who refused to give up, was at another demonstration, and at the end of it, the people were leaving the field, going back to the village. He heard a gunshot and turned around, and a boy named Mohammed Musa, 16 years old, was shot and had fallen. He went to go find him, to go help him rather, and he was shot as he ran towards the boy. The two of them were taken to Ramallah Hospital. His brother, who's the father of 3, was dead on arrival, and the boy was left paralyzed from the waist down. So these are the sort of people who are trying to fight the ongoing annexation of their land in non-violent ways on a weekly basis through demonstrations, and of course on a daily basis just by living there and trying to eke out their livelihoods. If we go to the next slide, this is an example of who the Israeli army is up against in most cases. When they talk, I mean, any of you know Mark Regev? He's the spokesperson for the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, really vile man generally. I heard him recently saying, rocks are very violent things, they're very dangerous things, which seem to just be absolutely insane, as if maintaining an occupation is done with soft gloves. So this is largely who the Israeli army, which again is what, the 4th or 5th strongest army in the world, This is who they are up against. And these are also, unfortunately, who most of their victims are. There have been about 21 people who have been killed at these demonstrations around the West Bank over the last few years. The average age of them is 18 years. Now, I'll wrap up by saying that I went out there originally to document the artwork and the graffiti because, as an optimist, I think that the wall won't be there one day, and so I thought it'd be great to sort of keep a record of these shows of solidarity and support from people from all around the world who, at grassroots levels where things are happening, where any change is going to come from, show what they have done and the marks that they left on the wall. And also, when I first went out there and witnessed this, the last bit of graffiti on the next slide is basically the thought that resonated with me or had the greatest impact. And if we go to that, I hope it leaves you with the same sort of feeling. If you can't read it, it says, "Now that I have seen, I am responsible." And of course, as US citizens with your tax money, and as me here as a British citizen, we are all responsible for the situation that continues to go on the ground today.
The book room.
So thank you for listening.
It's
and I hope
$20.
you'll join me in
And
doing
get a
some
copy of it while you're here. I'm going to go into this door for questions and answers. Want to try to get as many people to be able to ask a question of our presenter. So if you want to go ahead, I can call on you. Okay, so you first.
Do the Israelis allow you to climb up on their, allow the Palestinians to climb up on their blockhouses and paint on the wall?
Do the Israelis allow the Palestinians access to the wall to
Yes.
go up on a ladder?
Yes.
Generally not the Palestinians, but Westerners, yes. A lot of the artwork where it is deeper into cities like Bethlehem, away from the border, if you like, where Rachel's tomb sort of area, then they do have fewer restrictions there because they're not close to getting into the state, if you like. But certainly if you're a Westerner, you will have pretty much unlimited access to it. If you're Palestinian, then you should stay a safer distance further in.
I thought it was very poignant in the film that was shown just before you came in. The 7-year-old boy that they talked to, the mother was talking about her son, and they built the wall. They can see outside their window, and the little boy said that the wall feels like a big tomb. I mean, that doesn't move you. And then the second thing is a question. I keep thinking that the IDF's just going to come out of nowhere, and when people are painting, and so I'm like, what creative ways have they come up with to try and finish these pieces? Because I keep thinking, how are they going to finish them? Knowing that the way the security is, and so I don't know if you could speak to that.
I mean, I think similar to the gentleman's question, it really depends on where it is and who's doing it. The Westerners will get away with it because obviously the Israelis are not going to shoot a Westerner, or they're less likely to anyway because of the fallout. And so they, in the forward you see a picture of Ron English putting up that pardon our oppression there. So those guys were there for 2 weeks, all in all, putting up various things around there. So again, if you're a Westerner, I think you do have that liberty to do that. And if you're a Palestinian, first of all, a lot of Palestinians don't really do too much work on the wall itself. They tend to do stuff around the city and on the city walls themselves. So, I mean, I'm amazed at that one "to exist is to resist" with the woman with the big keffiyeh. That's right by the Israeli checkpoint. So there are soldiers there. The painting is there, and the soldiers are here, letting buses and car traffic goes back and forth. So obviously somebody did it there, and the Israelis allowed them to continue doing it. On the other side of the wall, somebody mentioned about the other side of the wall and what was on there. There are very few places where the Israeli side, where there is graffiti. Nothing to see here, again, is one of those few examples. I took that in 2008. I was there a couple of weeks ago, and all the artwork along that bit of the wall is exactly as it was then. Nobody has come and buffed it, which for me is quite surprising, because they do it in various spots. And somebody else also asked about the finish of the wall on the Israeli side. Oftentimes you do have a much nicer hue. It's concrete gray on the one side, on the Palestinian side, and on the Israeli side, it's much gentler on the eyes because it's sort of more organic, sandy colors. In some of the settlements, or the colonies, where you can see inside the wall, they've actually painted ripples of water. So you have sort of more of a Mediterranean feel to it. And then as you drive up the toll road in Israel, you have the West Bank on your right as you're driving north. And in many cases where the wall is, what they've done is basically just landscaped it so that you've got a hill with all sorts of grass or bushes all along there. So again, it's soft on the eyes and they don't have to see mentality there.
The gentleman with the hat, and then Freddie.
Yeah, thank you for a really powerful presentation. I went traveling around the West Bank this past summer with the African American delegation, and it's just, you know, absolutely incredible to see these people cut off from their land, and I wished I'd captured so many of these images that you had. One question I had a couple questions. One was, part of the reason of our delegation was to bring solidarity of African Americans with Palestinians and share the, you know, legacy of the struggles we've had here, and come to find out that they know the history of African Americans and have used much of the tactics of Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, you know, more than many African Americans might know today. So that was a really powerful exchange, and I'm wondering about the artistic exchange. I saw some graph pieces that looked like stuff that could have come out of the Bronx and, you know, the hip hop movement.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that was internationals or if Palestinians have also adopted that sort of hip hop graph style as well from African American culture. And then just one other question I have. I mean, the one thing that didn't make sense was the comment you made that Israel would have a right to build a wall if it was not cutting people off from their land in the West Bank. And I think, you know, that's the most egregious part of it, when you have a wall that goes around the water aquifers and cuts them off from it. That's clear, but it seems to me this kind of art would be all over a wall, even if it was on, you know, the 67 border as well. And it seems to me that they don't have a right to build a wall anywhere, given that there's, you know, 800,000 Palestinians that want to return, that there's Palestinians in Israel proper that can't visit their family. So even if it was on their border, so I'm wondering if you could explain what you think about that comment
Sure.
as well.
Sure. There is, from the interactions I've had with the few Palestinian artists that I've interviewed, there are exchanges going on with Western artists, and they welcome that sort of collaboration. And obviously there's going to then be a sort of cross-fertilization of styles and so forth. All the graffiti that I saw done by Palestinians didn't have that sort of hip-hop feel to it, and that was done by foreigners. But again, they've all said that, of course, there is this sort of dissemination of, cross-dissemination of ideas and styles and that sort of thing. And they're certainly open to more collaborations of that sort from the people I spoke to. So I'm sure that will happen. And again, I'm sure also that a lot of the Western artists who go there will obviously be influenced by the styles that they see around there as well. I mean, it's a fairly young field. You know, the wall is first started going up in 2003, so you know we're still relatively early. And when Banksy first went there in 2005, there was virtually nothing on the wall. And now, so since then, really, there's been this huge proliferation of paint and stenciling done on it. So I think it's still young, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more exchanges. I meet people on the ground there whenever I'm there, coming from all over the world to come and see it for themselves, and again, are interested in meeting a lot of the local artists as well. I'm constantly being emailed and asked to be put in touch with by different groups to meet the people on the ground there, so that's definitely going on. Of course, Israel, again, it has the legal right to build a wall on its border if it wants to. It has that legal right. Now, of course, as you say, there are all sorts of issues that complicate that, the fact that there are all sorts of unresolved issues, but those remain unresolved issues, and that doesn't really change the fact that Israel can still build that in the meantime. Like the wall now, I think it would still say huge volumes about Israel. There's a bit of graffiti, a bit of Arabic graffiti, which has a Palestinian man, and the quote in Arabic says, "The wall is in your head." And I think that says so much about the mentality there of, I mean, yesterday's news was that Israel's going to build a wall along the border with Lebanon. So that's the newest wall that's going to come up. 2 weeks ago I was there in Caesarea, which is next to, it's a very, very wealthy Jewish Israeli neighborhood. And on the other side, they built a massive sand wall. It's right on the sea. They built a massive sand wall, which is as high as the ceiling here, separating them from the Arab neighbors just north of them. So, you know, there are walls all around, and again, it's part of that sort of mentality, it seems, to just separate people like that and try and block out the reality. So again, they do have the right to do it. It would be wrought with all sorts of problems, and it would certainly be painted, as you said, regardless. But I mean, that's the international legal point, is that they can do that.
In this country, the Israeli lobby pretty much owns our Congress. Does Great Britain have a similar problem, or I can't understand why the EU and Great Britain are the same handcuffs the United States is under when it comes to Palestinians?
No, I think, fortunately, it's not the same situation, and I hope it doesn't start to move that way. Obviously, there is an pro-Israeli lobby, and it does try to influence whichever government is going to get in there. But it's nothing like what you have here in the U.S., which is just extraordinary. To hear Newt Gingrich talking about what he has to say about wishing he'd been in the IDF and not the American forces, and moving the embassy to Jerusalem and all this sort of stuff is, we just sit there and think, my God, that is so screwed up. So it doesn't have the same strength. And I was sitting on the earlier conversation with Nora from Electronic Intifada, and just that whole idea as well of campuses and the activities that are going on campus, and this whole. I went to Canada last year, and a lot of the student groups there weren't allowed to use the word apartheid with Israel because it incited racism and hatred and that sort of stuff. We really don't have anything like that in the UK, fortunately. So, I think also reading The Guardian and The Independent and comparing that with what I read in the New York Times, they're completely worlds apart. So I'm very, very grateful that that's the case.
Gentleman in the front here.
I have a couple of questions. As a photographer, it was very difficult for you to get into the places that you wanted to photograph. And the other thing I want to ask you is, did you have very many in-depth conversations with Israelis while you were there?
Okay. The first one, access to getting in. Around the wall is where it's a concrete wall, that's primarily in heavily populated areas. And then beyond that, you have the most sophisticated fence in the world, which can stretch for about, not that it can stretch, it stretches, it's about 200 feet wide, and it's ditches, razor wire, patrol road on either side, and so forth. In those areas, in those rural areas where it's that structure, getting into those seam zones, into those farming communities and that sort of stuff, it was difficult. But I contacted B'Tselem, which is an Israeli human rights organization, before I set out when I was in Jerusalem, and asked them what are my rights as a photographer and somebody with a press card. And they photocopied a section from the Israeli Forces Handbook, which basically states the rules that they have to abide by in confronting people with me and giving me access. So they photocopied it for me, and whenever a soldier said you can't get through, I would just show them this piece of paper. Oftentimes they then sort of said, all right, fine, you bastard, you can go. But oftentimes when they didn't do that, then I had another phone number for the press office of the Israeli forces, and there was a guy there I'd phone, and he would, within 20, 30 minutes, I would then get access if, in the meantime, the Palestinians hadn't come and taken me around another way. So access was restricted that way. Second question was, the end reminds me?
Did you have very many in-depth conversations with Israelis while you were there?
I spoke to, most of the Israelis I spoke to were on the left. So I spoke to them about why does this, how does this go on? Why don't people do anything about it and that sort of thing. So all the input I had was pretty much from left-leaning Israelis. I didn't speak to the vast majority of the other ones because we read about it every day. Their narrative is the dominant one in our news, and they are quoted endlessly in our media. So I really felt that I had the full picture from them through our media, and this part of the narrative certainly was underrepresented in our media.
Diane? And then
You promised to talk about how Palestinians felt about the maybe beautification of the wall?
Yeah. A lot of the elderly Palestinians in particular expressed concern that they didn't want their children to see the wall as a place of beauty. And so they thought that if it were left in its raw, gray state, that would mirror the nature of Israel as it should be mirrored. So they really didn't want people coming in. So a lot of those Westerners who went there with Banksy met with a bit of opposition by some of the people in the camps, and they were surprised to think, "Oh, sorry, we thought we were coming here to show solidarity with you, and you really don't want us to paint here?" And again, that was the idea, is that they didn't want it beautified and for their kids to regard it in that way. But at the same time, there are lots of other Palestinians that I spoke to and asked them what their views were about it. A lot of them said, "We really don't care. We're too busy with the occupation. We've got to deal with this day in, day out, and if you want to come and do this and go, that's fine. We're grateful for the show of solidarity, but we really don't have an opinion otherwise about it. And then the guy who was sort of Banksy's fixer on the ground, he told me that there was an awful lot of support of it, and certainly from the fact that it was just bringing in a lot of people, tourists who wouldn't otherwise necessarily turn up there to photograph a lot of the, it's basically a gallery, if you like. So they were coming there to photograph that, and that brought in a bit of money. So when you come down from the checkpoint at Bethlehem, the first thing that greets you is probably about a dozen taxi drivers at least saying, do you want a Banksy tour, do you want a Banksy tour? And then, they're earning their income that way. And of course, last year there were about 1 million people who went through Bethlehem, tourists, and along those corridors where those vehicles would go, that's where all these messages primarily are. So, as you drive through there or you walk through there, you're going to see all these shows of solidarity, and I think that's a pretty strong statement as well. But at the same time, again, you have to think about when somebody says, Donna, will you marry me? And somebody's shop is shut down and they've lost their property. When they see that sort of thing, they must think, you guys are insensitive. You don't understand the situation.
Right there?
Yeah, have you ever seen the film Europa?
No.
You haven't. I wish you would sometime. I wish you would. I saw it at one theater in Portland here, and it's this young kid in the about 1939 or 40, something like that, gets into the Nazi youth, and he can't say anything about his being Jewish or anything like that. And it goes on and on about that. Oh, he's on a train, and one of the windows is open, and they're all soaped up. And he brushes the soap aside. I guess this guy is still alive today. And he brushes that soap aside, and he sees out of that window a Jewish ghetto, and no one there is. And finally, one old man hobbles by. Well, this is what this wall is all about. How could the country of Israel, they supposedly they're supposed to represent the Jewish people. How could they in any wise place themselves up with the Nazi Gestapo?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of graffiti about that, challenging the Israelis, saying, you who have experienced this whole ghettoization, how could you do this to other people now?
Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, there was one section of the wall where it said something about the apartheid wall. That is actually a piece from the longest letter in the world, which is written in the Aram neighborhood. It's just under 2,000 words long, and it stretches for 1.5 miles along the wall. And it's written by a guy named Farid Isaac, who was in Nelson Mandela's first government. He's a human rights campaigner in South Africa. And it's basically his letter to Palestinians, to the Israelis, and to Jews worldwide, and to us. And he's talking about how the Afrikaners were oppressed and then turned into the victimizers in South Africa with their system of apartheid. And Isaac says, now that I've come to Palestine and seen what you live with, you are living actually under a more brutal and repressive form of apartheid than we ever knew. And so again, he says, there's a very poignant part where he says to the Jews there, actually it's a quote from Desmond Tutu, saying, and I say to my Jewish brothers and sisters, have you such short memories? I think it's a very, very powerful message.
Beautiful.
It's unfortunately on the wrong side of the wall.
Well, I think that's what we've got for time-wise, so.
If I can just add one thing that I meant to open this whole thing with, and that is that there's the story of Picasso when he was living in German-occupied Paris. And apparently one of the SS guards said to him, they saw a picture of Guernica, and they said, did you do this? And his response was, no, you did this. And so again, I think a lot of the artwork here goes the exact same way with Israel's occupation and oppression. So again, thanks for